The moment I knew everything was about to collapse wasn't in the boardroom. It wasn't in the financial reports or buried deep in some spreadsheet. It was at 2 a.m. when I sat alone in my apartment, staring at a set of numbers that didn't add up, my stomach sinking with the kind of dread you can't explain away. I was the risk manager at one of the largest firms in the country, a job that required me to lose sleep so no one else had to. My role was simple in theory: protect the company from blowing itself up. But in practice, it meant fighting against egos, ambition, and a culture that valued speed over caution. That night, as I pored over the data, the problem leapt off the screen. A massive investment, one the CEO himself had pushed through with all the bravado of a gambler on a hot streak, was about to turn toxic. The numbers screamed risk, the kind of cascading failure that could erase hundreds of millions in days. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I ran the models over and over again, hoping I'd made a mistake. But each time the outcome was the same: if we didn't pull back immediately, we were headed straight off a cliff. The next morning, I walked into the executive floor with my report clutched in my hand. The building always smelled faintly of polished marble and overpriced coffee, a temple to success, to wealth, to the illusion of invincibility. And at the center of it all was our CEO, charismatic, sharp, the kind of man who thrived on risk because it made him look fearless. I asked for 10 minutes of his time, just 10. He gave me 5. I laid it out as simply as I could. The investment was unstable, the market conditions were shifting faster than expected, and if we didn't adjust immediately, we stood to lose everything. My voice was steady, but inside, my heart pounded like a war drum. He didn't even look at the details. He skimmed the first page, then leaned back with that trademark smirk I'd seen 1,000 times before. "You worry too much," he said. "That's your job, isn't it? To see shadows where there aren't any." I wanted to shake him. I wanted to scream that this wasn't paranoia, it was math. Cold, unforgiving math. But he had already moved on, dismissing me with a wave of his hand, already lining up his next victory lap. As I walked out of that office, my report still clutched uselessly in my hand, I felt the weight of inevitability settle on my shoulders. It wasn't a question of if the crash would come. It was a question of when. And when it did, it wouldn't just wipe out a number on a spreadsheet. It would unravel everything: the reputation he had built, the security of the people who worked here, and the illusion that anyone at the top actually listened to the warnings of those paid to protect them. 48 hours later, my prediction came true. But in that moment, standing in the shadow of a CEO too arrogant to hear me out, I knew exactly how this story would end. To understand why my warning was brushed aside so easily, you have to understand the culture of that company. From the outside, it looked like a temple of brilliant glass walls, marble floors, a place where the smartest minds in finance shaped the future. But inside, it was more like a gladiator arena. Ego wasn't just tolerated, it was worshipped. Whoever shouted the loudest, whoever promised the biggest returns, whoever looked the most fearless, that was who rose to the top. I was neither loud nor reckless. My strength was analysis foresight, the ability to see risks before they became disasters. But in a culture that prized bravado over caution, that made me an outsider. My role was essential, but my voice was treated like background noise. The CEO set the tone. He wasn't just ambitious, he was addicted to risk. He'd built his career on big bets, the kind that made headlines when they paid off. And because he had a history of landing on his feet, everyone around him acted like he was untouchable. If he called something a win, it became a win, even if the numbers whispered otherwise. I can't count how many times I'd raised concerns only to be brushed off. "You're too negative. Stop slowing us down. This is why we don't bring you into strategy discussions." It wasn't just him, it was the whole leadership circle. They wanted cheerleaders, not watchdogs. And anyone who questioned their momentum was treated like dead weight. The irony is, I wasn't trying to stop growth, I was trying to protect it. Every model I built, every late-night analysis, was an attempt to make sure the company didn't implode under its own arrogance. But arrogance had become the currency of success. They didn't want guardrails. They wanted fireworks. That culture of recklessness seeped into everything. New hires were taught to think big but not to question. Bonuses were tied to short-term wins, not sustainable strategies. And anyone who dared to pump the brakes was quietly sidelined. It was a system designed to reward the illusion of invincibility until reality inevitably broke through. For me, it was suffocating. I'd walk into meetings knowing my insights could save millions, only to watch them ignored because they didn't fit the narrative of endless growth. I'd see men with less data, less preparation, and far less caution be celebrated simply because they spoke with confidence. And yet, I stayed. Why? Because I believed that at some point substance would matter. That eventually the truth in the numbers would speak louder than the arrogance in the room. But the longer I stayed, the more I realized that truth wasn't enough in a culture built on ego. That's why my warning about the 300-mount deal barely registered. It wasn't that the numbers weren't clear, it was that I wasn't considered clear. In their eyes, I was a worrier, a speed bump on the road to glory. My words were background noise to men chasing their next headline. And when arrogance becomes the filter through which every decision is made, disaster isn't an accident. It's inevitable. The breaking moment came in a boardroom packed with power. Investors were on the video wall, the executive team sat in leather chairs around the table, and the CEO stood at the head like a general ready to march into battle. On my laptop screen, the numbers glowed in red. My models weren't vague, they were screaming. The acquisition he was about to push through carried hidden liabilities, toxic debt, and overinflated valuations. It wasn't just risky, it was a ticking time bomb. I took a breath and did what I was hired to do. I presented the facts, calm, clear, with every calculation backed by hard data. This deal is unstable. Within days of closing, we could see liquidity strain that will ripple across every line of business. My recommendation is to pull back and renegotiate or walk away entirely. The room went silent for half a second. I thought maybe they'd listen. But then the CEO laughed. Not a nervous laugh, a dismissive one. See, this is why I don't invite the risk team to the table. Always crying wolf. Always telling us why things can't be done. He waved a hand like he was brushing away a fly. We're not in this business to play safe. We're here to make history. And history remembers the bold, not the timid. The investors chuckled politely, some of the executives nodded. And just like that, the trap was sealed. My data months of work late nights, double-check calculations, was reduced to a punchline in his victory speech. I felt my stomach drop. Not because he embarrassed me, but because I realized in that moment, this was the point of no return. He wasn't just ignoring me. He was publicly declaring that my voice carried no weight. He was making it clear in front of the people who mattered most that his ego mattered more than the truth. The betrayal wasn't just personal. It was institutional. I wasn't just being sidelined. The very foundation of rational decision-making was being sacrificed on the altar of his ambition. I sat there frozen while he launched into his pitch. We close this deal and we double our footprint. We'll be in every market worth being in. This is our moonshot. The board applauded, the investors smiled, the vote went through unanimous. And me, I realized I was powerless to stop it. I had given them the facts, I had done my duty, and now I had to watch the inevitable play out like a slow-motion car crash. Walking out of that boardroom, I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't just another instance of being ignored. This was the moment I understood that no matter how right I was, the culture here would never let my truth win. And if the only thing they respected was spectacle, then the spectacle was coming. They just didn't know it yet. When the boardroom door shut behind me that day, I knew I had two choices. I could stew in frustration, or I could prepare for the storm I knew was coming. I chose the latter. I started quietly, almost invisibly. No grand speeches, no confrontations, just small, deliberate moves. Every morning before the rest of the office filled in, I'd arrive early and run the numbers again, stress testing every possible outcome of the deal. The models always told the same story: collapse was inevitable. It wasn't a matter of if, it was when. I began documenting everything: emails, memos, presentations, timestamps. Not because I wanted revenge, at least not yet, but because I knew once things unraveled, everyone would scramble to point fingers. I refused to be their scapegoat. My work would speak for itself, quietly preserved, ready for the day the truth surfaced. At the same time, I started preparing the teams who would feel the brunt of the fallout. Not openly, God forbid I tip my hand and get branded a saboteur, but in subtle ways. A nudge here, a warning there, adjustments to cash flow buffers that looked routine but were really life preservers. Little things that could keep key systems running if liquidity tightened the way I knew it would. I even reached out to a few trusted colleagues outside the company, people who respected me, people who knew the quality of my work. I didn't say much, just enough to hint that if things went south, I might be ready for a new chapter. It wasn't betrayal, it was survival. But here's the thing about silent preparation: it requires patience. And patience feels like torture when you know disaster is barreling toward you. Every time I passed the CEO strutting through the office, boasting about our bold future, I wanted to scream. Every time I overheard an executive parroting his empty slogans, I wanted to shake them. Instead, I bit my tongue. I smiled when necessary. I nodded in meetings, even when the rhetoric was delusional. On the surface, I played the part of the loyal lieutenant. Underneath, I was bracing for impact, stockpiling truth like ammunition. Late at night, when the office was quiet, and only the glow of my screen lit the room, I would whisper to myself, "You warned them. They didn't listen. Now it's their turn to face reality." I wasn't praying for the collapse. But I wasn't afraid of it either, because when it came, and I knew it would, I would be ready. And when the smoke cleared, no one would be able to say I hadn't seen it coming. The implosion didn't creep in quietly, it detonated. 48 hours after the deal closed, the cracks split open, and by the end of that week, $300 million had evaporated. It started with a headline. A financial news outlet broke the story that the company we had acquired was sitting on undisclosed liabilities. Within hours, the debt markets caught wind and trading screens lit up like wildfire. Our stock plummeted. Investors, once smiling in their tailored suits, were suddenly demanding answers. I watched the chaos unfold in real time from my desk. Phones ringing nonstop, executives sprinting between conference rooms. The same people who had laughed at my warnings were now pale, frantic, whispering to each other like cornered animals. Then came the liquidity crunch. Vendors demanded early payments, spooked by the headlines. Creditors pulled back. Cash dried up faster than anyone thought possible. The CEO, once the self-proclaimed visionary, was reduced to barking orders no one could follow. He told the PR team to spin it, but no amount of wordplay could hide the reality: the empire he had promised was a castle built on sand. And here's the part that hit hardest. It wasn't me standing in the middle of the storm being blamed. My groundwork paid off. Every memo, every flagged risk, every time-stamped file was airtight proof that I had seen this coming. When the board demanded explanations, I didn't need to defend myself. The evidence spoke louder than I ever could. The CEO, however, had no shield. Clips of him boasting about the bold moonshot were replayed on business channels. Analysts dissected his arrogance, his dismissal of risk, his obsession with spectacle. The same investors who once applauded his bravado were now calling for his resignation. In a surreal twist, some of them started looking to me. The woman he had silenced, mocked, and ignored was now the one with credibility. The irony wasn't lost on me. The real revenge wasn't in gloating. I didn't need to rub his nose in the wreckage. Watching his empire collapse under the weight of his own ego was enough. The tables had turned not because I pulled some dramatic stunt, but because the truth-patient, undeniable truth finally caught up with him. He had gambled with $300 million and he lost. Not because the world was against him, not because markets were unfair, but because he refused to listen. And for the first time in years, my voice, the one they had dismissed as noise, was finally impossible to ignore. The fallout was swift and brutal. Within weeks, the board convened an emergency session, and the CEO, who once strutted like a king, was quietly forced to resign. No farewell party, no standing ovation, just a curt email and a press release buried on a Friday afternoon. His legacy, once painted in bold strokes, was reduced to a cautionary tale in the business press. The company itself never fully recovered. The $300 million hole gutted our balance sheet, forcing layoffs and asset sales. What had been a growth story became a survival story, and survival doesn't inspire Wall Street. By the end of the year, our market cap was a shadow of what it once had been. For me, the aftermath was different. I wasn't celebrated with a parade, but the quiet nods of respect started coming in. Colleagues who once brushed me off as too cautious now stopped by my office to ask for advice. Investors reached out to me directly, bypassing layers of hierarchy, wanting to hear my perspective. It wasn't power in the flashy sense, but it was recognition. And recognition, after years of being invisible, felt like victory. I didn't feel joy in the company's pain. The layoffs hurt. Good people lost jobs because of one man's arrogance. That part stung. But I did feel vindicated, not because I wanted him to fail, but because the truth mattered, and for once, the truth didn't get buried under ego and politics. As for the CEO, last I heard, he tried to launch a thought leadership podcast. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The man who ignored the biggest red flag of his career now wanted to lecture others about vision. But the world had moved on, and so had I. What stayed with me most wasn't the collapse, it was the lesson. That sometimes revenge isn't about scheming or striking back. Sometimes revenge is just standing your ground, doing your work, and letting reality catch up. Because reality always does. In the end, vindication wasn't about him losing $300 million. It was about me finally realizing that my value was never defined by whether he listened or not. My voice had always mattered. It just took a collapse for the rest of the world to hear it. And when they finally did, I didn't shout, I didn't gloat. I simply spoke, and this time they listened. That more than anything else was the real victory.